How about you?
I'm thinking this one between my girl.
Yeah.
I'm thinking Trish.
Yeah. How's that?
That one's interesting. It's like, wow, I don't know how you.
Yeah. Everybody?
Yikes.
Hey, can I get a mic check? Can you guys hear me back at home?
Yeah.
I'll send you an edible arrangement at the end of the semester for always being my mic check person.
Thank you.
So how are we doing today, gentlemen? Everybody feeling good about the quiz? So let me go ahead and open up my quiz. I'm going to go over the quiz that we just had. So that's quiz number 5, I believe, and you guys can follow along if you want. If not, no big deal. We had quiz number 5, and it was due a couple nights ago. And then we have a quiz that's going to be published tonight. So it's one of those short answer quizzes where you gotta answer the questions by writing. It's not multiple choice. So let's see. Okay, so like I said, we're going to start out class today. I'm going to go over the quiz, and then once we have all the quiz answers, then we'll roll into our lecture. So today we're talking about the business cycle, and we're going to talk about kind of how that relates to the international economy. I hope it's an interesting lecture. I plan this one to be interesting. I'm specifically requesting that you guys find it interesting, but we'll see. And I don't know where my pen is. Okay, so before we begin, do we have any questions? You ready for quiz 5?
Yeah.
I was really looking forward to doing this on Monday. I was like, all weekend, I was like, man, I can't wait to do quiz 5. And then it was turned in on Monday, and I was like, okay, I'll have to wait until Wednesday, I guess. All right, so the first question. Who was the Roman emperor who issued the Edict of Maximum Prices? All right, so let me see a show of hands if it was Diet Coke. Nobody's raising their hand. How about Mr. TikTok? No. How about Joe Biden? I don't think so. It was Diocletian. Okay, and you do not need a PhD to know that answer. I was hoping that you would Google it if you didn't watch the lecture, actually. So it's like this. I didn't want to make any of these questions based off of anything historical. So I didn't want you to need to know the history of something in order to get the right answer, right? Because this is not a history class. This is an economics class. And so I asked you a historical question. Who was the Roman emperor who did something? That's not anything to do with economics, right? But I made the other answers pretty stupid. So I was hoping that would be obvious. Diet Coke can never rule an empire. Unless it's the empire of taste. I don't know. Mr. TikTok, a lot of my students asked me earlier if I'm like really into TikTok. I've actually never been on TikTok. I don't know much about it other than it's like, I don't know, it's for like dance videos. People post dance videos and then talk about stuff being mid a lot. Sounds like fun. I don't know. It'd be cool. Maybe I'll download it. All right. And it's not Joe Biden. Joe Biden has actually implemented a lot of price controls since he became president. Unfortunately, though, none of them were the Edict of Maximum Prices. Or maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. The Edict of Maximum Prices, it kind of crashed the Roman Empire's economy, so maybe it's a good thing that he has not done that. So it's Diocletian, right? Diocletian. Cool name, cool guy, maybe. Fun fact about Diocletian is he was the Roman emperor who instituted something known as the Tetrarchy, which means the rule of 4. He divided the Roman Empire into 4 quadrants. Basically, though, what that really means is that he divided the empire in half. And so he ruled the western half, and then he had a co-emperor who was like his immediate subordinate, who kind of had another part of the western half, but basically he ruled the western half, and then another emperor ruled in the east. Intriguingly enough, Western and Eastern Europe have been fundamentally different since basically the beginning of time, owing to things like geography and culture. In fact, at the turn of this century, so in the year 2000, the wealth difference between Eastern and Western Europeans was greater than the difference in wealth between white Americans and African Americans. Eastern Europe and Western Europe have been different from each other for a long time. Diocletian recognized this. And so it's interesting because the Western Roman Empire didn't last for another couple hundred years. So Diocletian issued the edicts that created the Tetrarchy in about the 280s AD, and the Western Empire fell in the year 479 AD. That's when Romulus Augustus abdicated. He was the last Western Roman emperor. The Eastern Roman Empire lasted up until about the 1400s. So long time they stuck around. Wouldn't you know it, maybe the Tetrarchy was like a good idea. I don't know. Maybe we should try it here in the United States. I don't know. Maybe we should ask Joe Biden if he wants to issue any edicts. I don't know the answers. I'm just teaching you guys. All right. So question number 2. According to the Edict of Maximum Prices, the price of a chicken was set at 30 denarii, 30 Roman silver coins. That's what a denarius was. Plural is known as denarii. So this is known as a price ceiling. What would have happened to the sale of chickens as a result of the imposition of this price control? So notice I did not say what did happen. I said what would happen. I'm not asking a historical question. I'm telling you guys that there's a price control and what is the result of the price control. So the answer to that one was that producers of chickens could no longer count on making money on the sale of their chickens because the price was not determined by market forces. Therefore, they lost incentives to produce them, thereby reducing supply. This is no different than a price control being implemented during a bout of price gouging, because price gouging is just a very, very rapid instance of that law of demand we talked about. So basically, whenever you're looking at the price ceiling of 30 denarii, that is saying that producers of chickens, also known as farmers, are no longer making money on the sale of their chickens because their chickens would be priced higher than that. Remember, Diocletian did not issue the Edict of Maximum Prices just because he was bored. Price controls say that you're not allowed to pay for a price ceiling in this instance more than the prescribed amount. So that kind of logically is telling you that chickens are more expensive than 30 denarii, right, in the market. But that's not what Diocletian said. So whenever you're not making any money producing something, why would you produce it, right? So people stop producing chickens. And what happens when you stop producing something is supply goes down, but demand doesn't change. And whenever you have a demand up here and a supply down here relative to each other, we have higher demand than supply. Where does the price go, Ryan?
Oh,
All right. So we have a shortage, right? We don't have a lot of chickens. That's the result. So thank Diocletian. It actually was 30 denarii. That's a true thing. The price of a chicken, according to the edict, was 30 denarii. I didn't make that up, but I just wanted to know what you guys thought about it. How would you interpret that as what would happen logically as a result of the imposition of a price control? And in this case, that's a price ceiling. I'm not going to read every answer, but if you have any questions, let me know. One of the things I wanted to discuss was that the lower price meant that everyone could afford a chicken. That's not true, right? Like if I'm imposing a price control on something and all of a sudden the price goes down, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody can afford everything, right? So all of a sudden you have a disruption in the supply and then the price gets distorted. The logical result is a shortage, right? That's what logically follows. So that answer is not correct. All right. So the next question number 3, select the true statement. All right. So I'm not going to read all these. I'll just read this one to you. Oh, by the way, I should say that in this quiz, I did a lot of this thing where I would write a bunch of the same answer and then just change one word. All right. So that's what this one was. Select the true statement. And for those of you at home, the answers to this question all look very similar, but I'll read you the right one. The Fed, so the Federal Reserve System or the Federal Reserve, the Fed buys securities in order to inject money into the economy and increase the money supply. This is why I told you guys that whenever you're buying something, it's usually pretty easy to see where the money ends up. If I go buy an orange, I no longer have my money. The person I bought the orange from has my money. That's not the same whenever we're talking about money as the thing that I buy, because I'm buying money. So the answer to this one, the Fed buys securities in order to inject money into the economy. They trade with people who are in the economy in order to get money or give money. right? That's what buying and selling treasury securities is. So when the Fed buys securities, they're giving money to the people that have them, and they're taking those securities back. The money now is floating around in the economy. So therefore, the economy increases in its size. The money supply increases, right? Not necessarily the economy, but the money supply. So the answer was that the Fed buys securities in order to inject money into the economy and increase the money supply. Following on that one? That's why I keep telling you guys, it's tricky. All right. So, next question. A very generous emperor named Mansa Musa distributed considerable amounts of gold in Cairo in 1325. What was the economic result of this action? So for those of you who do not know, Cairo is in Egypt. It's the capital of Egypt, and it has been the capital for many, many years. 1325 is almost exactly 700 years ago. So let's just say that's a long time. All right. So the answer to this one, the huge injection of gold into the money supply caused rampant inflation, thereby crashing the economy. When you expand the money supply so quickly that the economy cannot catch up with its activity, when you increase the size of the money supply, but the beehive can't catch up with its buzzing, you get inflation. That's a problem, right? So it doesn't matter if it's gold or dollars or denarii or beans. If you increase the size of the money supply too much, the price system becomes distorted and the economy crashes. That's why in our modern economy here in the United States, the Fed has used a policy known as quantitative easing for several years now, since 08 really, to try and increase inflation at a small enough rate to where it's not going to crash the economy, but a large enough rate to where a lot of people can make a lot of money really quickly. It doesn't always work like that, but that's the idea. So just a couple of these other answers are maybe worth reading for this question. So everyone was happy and no inflation occurred at all. I mean, you guys have been in my class now for like what, 7-8 weeks? Something happens, right? So it's not that answer. All right, the huge injection of gold meant that everyone was now rich and the economy prospered. I wish if during the COVID pandemic, when everybody got $1,400 put in their bank account to pay for their rent, why didn't the government give everybody like $1 million? Why didn't they give me $1 billion? Why didn't they give all of us $1 billion? That's exactly why. Okay, you do it too much, the economy crashes. Not so good. All right, and the gold was quickly and efficiently converted into other forms of wealth, therefore installing inflation. Again, not true. When you have a huge injection into the money supply, the price system is distorted and you cannot quickly and efficiently convert things into wealth. So, sorry to say, Mansa Musa, he was up to no good. He was trying to be a nice guy, but he ended up making a mistake, I think. But let's not put the blame too much on him. At least he was trying to just be kind. All right, next question. Before the Second World War, China was ruled by the Nationalist Party and maintained a limited private banking system. By 1935, this system had been reorganized into a tightly controlled central banking system, which issued its own currency. How did this change lead to inflation of the money supply? All right, I'm going to read you the right answer. Prior to the change, many banks issued their own currencies and prevented inflation by competing with each other. That is to say, if a bank inflated its currency, it would collapse because its customers would take their business to other banks that provided a better alternative. The central banking system had no competition and therefore suffered no consequences when it inflated its currency. All right, that is the correct answer. The banks in China, you don't need to know any information about Chinese history to know the answer to this question. I didn't write these questions thinking that you needed to know the history in order to answer them. This is an economic concept. When currencies compete, they hedge each other. They prevent each other from inflating. What happens? So if I am a person and I'm getting my money from Bank A, the bank in Beijing, and there's another bank maybe a few hundred miles away in Shanghai that I could also get my money from, I just happen to live in Beijing, those two banks actually compete with each other for customers. So if the bank in Beijing inflates its currency too much, what happens? Customers will go to Shanghai to do their banking, right? and the bank in Beijing will collapse because nobody's using it anymore. They run out of money, they go insolvent, they go belly up. That's the end of that bank, right? And the bank in Shanghai is pretty happy. But other people will step in and try to buy up the assets that the bank in Beijing had and reopen a bank in a new way. They get rid of the old currency, they restart a new one. As long as they have the ability to compete, banks will compete against each other and they will prevent each other from inflating their currency. However, when the currency is monopolized, whenever there's only one currency, there is no competition. So the bank can inflate its currency as much as it wants to, and it's not going to matter. They will get away with it. There's nothing stopping them from doing it. It's just a law at that point. The government will say, print as much as you want. And in fact, in China, before World War II and during World War II, they not only printed as much as they wanted, they printed way more than they wanted. They printed so much money, in fact, that the money had to be printed in Britain and flown into China. That's how much they were printing. That's how bad inflation got in nationalist China. All right. Yeah, like I said, you didn't need to know anything about Chinese history. One of the answers to that one was no inflation occurred in China during this time. But if you read the question, I just told you that inflation occurred. So let's choose that one. All right. What happens when the Federal Reserve sells securities, meaning they give away the security and take the money, right? Money is taken out of circulation, thereby raising the funds rate. So that's the answer to that one. What happens when the Federal Reserve purchases securities? The Federal Reserve purchases securities, right? So that's different from when we sell securities and when we buy securities. Those are two different actions. And on the one hand, when the Fed sells securities, they give away the security and in exchange they get money. On the other hand, when they buy securities, they take away the securities from the people who have them and they give money. So the answer to this one, money is put into circulation, thereby lowering the funds rate. All right. Next question. How does the funds rate influence inflation? When the funds rate increases, so it goes up, interest rates increase, right? So the interest rates follow the funds rate. So when the funds rate increases, interest rates increase, which lowers aggregate demand and thus prices, thereby reducing the effects of inflation. Okay. The next answer in this question was nearly identical. When the funds rate increases, interest rates increase, which lowers aggregate demand and thus prices, thereby reducing the rate of inflation. That was not the right answer, all right? Because when the funds rate changes, that does not affect the rate of inflation. The actual rate of inflation is determined by how much money Washington, D.C. is putting into our money supply. That's not determined by the funds rate, that's determined by the Treasury. The Treasury prints money in its mints, right? And that's all at the direction of Fed and the president and everybody all together, right? Now, we cannot change the rate of inflation by adjusting the funds rate. The rate of inflation has to do with the size of the money supply. When the funds rate changes, demand is what has changed. Overall aggregate demand in the economy, right? And when demand lowers, in order to attract customers, companies have to lower their prices. So when demand goes down, so does price, right? Remember this, when demand goes down, so does the price. So the answer is that it reduces the effect of inflation. When the price goes up, you need to reduce that price rise. That, though, is not really inflation, right? The idea is that when you expand the money supply, we have inflation that filters its way through the economy, and the effect of that is that the price of everything goes up. So the effect of inflation is that the general price level in an economy goes up. Now, as like a colloquial shorthand, people will call that inflation, but economically speaking, that's not true inflation, right? And so that's why when we talk about the Fed adjusting the funds rate and influencing the interest rate in order to influence aggregate demand overall, they are not influencing the rate of inflation. If they wanted to change the rate of inflation, all they need to do is stop printing money in the Treasury, right? They just pick up the phone and call the Treasury and they say, hey, Mr. Treasury, stop printing money, and therefore the rate of inflation goes down. But that's not how they do it in this country, all right? The reason why I keep repeating myself with this specific point is that like 20 years from now, you're going to be watching the news and you're going to forget most of the stuff you learned at Metro State University. Okay, that's the honest truth. I got my undergraduate degree just a few years ago here at Denver, and I don't remember most of the stuff that I studied, right? You just forget a lot of it. But the point that I'm making is that in 20 years, you're going to be watching the news and you're going to see some chairman of the Federal Reserve come on and say, oh, we've adjusted the interest rate and therefore we're combating inflation. But they're not. And you know that because you had some dude 20 years ago repeating himself endlessly and telling you they're not. It's not affecting the rate of inflation, right? It's a monetary trick. It's designed to keep prices low while we expand the size of the money supply. That's the trick, right? That's how that actually works. And that's why I keep repeating myself, because it's important to know. All right. So why are high rates of inflation so harmful to an economy? The answer to this one: the rapid increase in prices at different rates across the economy distort the price system and its ability to signal, thereby reducing economic efficiency and slowing the economy overall. All right. Later on, when we discuss that, I thought I drew that a lot more beautifully, the graph on the board. I'll change the camera. You'll see it's kind of ugly, but I'll talk about how you can inflate the currency, and the short run effect of inflation is pretty good. You can have like an increase in economic activity and a decrease in the level of unemployment. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't work like that in the long run. All right, I'll show you. All right, so why are high rates of inflation so harmful? Is they distort the price system. So the answer to that one was the rapid increases in prices. My answers are not in the same order as yours are, so I don't know what selection that was, but it's that answer, okay? So next question: what effect does a change in demand have on inflation? When demand decreases, businesses must lower prices to attract customers, thereby offsetting the effects of inflation. So that is what I just explained a few minutes earlier. That's what that is. All right. Inflation and demand always change at opposing rates is also not correct. Okay, so when the Roman Emperor Commodus reduced the content of silver found in the denarius, what was the result? So when Joaquin Phoenix reduced the reduced the overall amount of silver in the denarius. You guys have ever seen Gladiator, the movie from the year 2000 by Ridley Scott? It's like Russell Crowe is the gladiator and he's the general, Maximus, whatever. And then Joaquin Phoenix plays Commodus, the treacherous emperor, right? That's Commodus. So he was a real person. I don't think there was like this, this drama involving some general, but like in real life, he was an emperor that was up to no good, and he deflated the currency, or he inflated the currency quite a bit. He did it 2 major times. First time in 150 years, I think, that the denarius was destabilized, was under the rule of Commodus. But again, let's not beat a dead horse. This is not a history class. So when the Roman Emperor Commodus reduced the content of silver found in the denarius, what was the result? The answer: decreasing the amount of silver in each coin decreased its value, leading to inflation because people needed more denarii to buy what they previously could before their coins were reduced in size. Now let me say this. The singular form of that word is denarius and the plural form is denarii. Just the same as the singular form of our currency is just a dollar and the plural is dollars. All right, so you don't have to be a scholar in Latin. I'm just telling you that now. So don't let that confuse you. But it's interesting. Our money, we inflate the paper currency, we just print more of it. In those days, if they wanted to inflate the currency, they would take each silver coin and shave it and then take the remaining silver and make a new coin, right? So sometimes the coinage was reduced, not a lot, maybe a couple percentages. Like, so 100% of the silver was reduced to maybe like 87, 90% of what it was, but that leads to inflation, right? If you do the math, if I have a 90% sized coin that I got after I had a 100% sized coin, that's a 10% inflation rate. No? So they would reduce the size overall of these coins. The effect was the same. So we inflate the currency nowadays by printing more dollars. They simply minted more coins with the silver that they had. They increased the actual amount of coinage in the empire. Crazy, right? Silver coins 2,000 years ago behave exactly the same as paper dollars in 2023. And yeah, I don't know. I really like Roman history. I really like history in general. I try not to talk about it too much, although I can't help myself. How often have you guys been thinking about the Roman Empire?
Lately, even more so
Yeah.
after this.
Well, that's good. That's been my plan all along. I don't actually care about economics. This whole class has been a big scheme to try to get the Roman Empire on everybody's mind. And it's working. All right, cool. Okay, what is correct about the capital to labor ratio? All right, capital divided by labor means that a low ratio indicates low wages. So a low ratio, does anybody understand how to formulate a ratio? Do you know how to formulate a ratio? It's like when you have a number in the numerator and a number in the denominator, right? More Latin words, okay? I didn't make this stuff up. So the numerator is the number that is found on top of a fraction, also known as a ratio. The denominator is the number that's on the bottom. When you divide the numerator by the denominator, you get a number. If that number is very low, that means you have a low ratio. If that number is very high, which just means close to 1, then that means you have a high ratio. So a low ratio means that you have low wages, right? You have a lot of labor and not a lot of capital. Very inefficient. And when stuff's very inefficient, it's not productive. When stuff's not productive, you don't get paid as much. That's the logic behind that in the shorthand. So the answer to that one was capital divided by labor means that a low ratio indicates low wages. And that actually is what you do. So capital is on top and labor is on the bottom of that ratio. Okay. And I'm going to stop saying the word ratio because there are some words that I have trouble with, like nominal. It's a hard one, Omar. I don't know. All right. It's also Latin. So what are the two categories of debt found within the national debt of the United States of America? The answer to that one, intragovernmental and public. Both of those words are Latin words. So intragovernmental and public. Public meaning owned by you and me. Intragovernmental meaning owned by other governments. Easy enough, right? Not positive and negative, not foreign and domestic, not real and... All right. What is the difference between a debt and a deficit? All right. A deficit occurs when an entity spends more money in a given time period than it takes in. Debt is the accumulation of deficits owed. So let's say our given time period is 1 year. And if in 1 year I spend more money than I make, I have a deficit. Now let's add up 5 years of having a deficit, and we call that having a debt. All right, I have a debt to pay. Cool. The time period that people use to determine if you have a deficit or not is arbitrary. What's not arbitrary is the fact that you have a budget over a certain period of time. So if you have a budget and it's constrained by a time period, we would call that a deficit if you spend more than you take in within those given constraints. Does that make sense? That's an easy one, right? All right. Select the true statement. Okay, market equilibrium prices occur at the overlapping point of two amounts. The lowest a seller is willing to sell something for, and the highest a buyer is willing to buy something for. That's pretty logical, right? I think economics is a highly logical science, and it is a science, if you will. Basically, that's what I demonstrated when I drew that beautiful Michelangelo-style graph on Monday. I think it was Monday, right? And our guest, Eugen, actually pointed out I made a mistake on that graph. It was market equilibrium was supposed to be at 2.5, not 3. So for those of you who didn't know this, I drew a nice price curve, and there was like a graph on the board. It was like really basic, and it was from a scale of 0 to 5. So you start out at 0, go all the way up to 5. Now I'm not going to explain it because I already explained it twice. But basically the equilibrium should have been 5 divided by 2, which is 2.5. But I drew my nice dotted lines at 3. So I said market equilibrium is at 3, but that's not accurate. So it's at 2. It could be accurate if market equilibrium was at 3, but I was just demonstrating an even exchange. So when the actual quantity demanded and the price for that quantity is equal. So it's always just take whatever the quantity is and divide the number by 2, and then you get the price. So 2.5. But I told you guys, no math, so don't worry about that. Okay, what is the definition of aggregate demand? It's the overall demand for something found in an economy. Remember, aggregate means total. The A in macroeconomics, if you will, represents the A in aggregate. I think it's a cool trick. All right, let's calculate some GDP. So consumption, 20 trillion. Then we add investment, 7 trillion. That gives us $27 trillion. We'll add another 8 trillion for government expenditures, which yields 35 trillion in total. Now, this is the tricky part. Imports and exports. Which one comes first? Am I subtracting imports from exports, or am I subtracting exports from imports? So, if neither of you guys want to take a crack at this one,
Exports from imports.
there you go. Exports get subtracted. No, that's not true. That's the other way around. Imports, yeah. Screw me up. Okay, so what you do.
Yeah, imports from- Sorry, it's a negative.
It's okay. So you subtract imports from exports, but think about it logically. Exports are the stuff that you give away. Imports are the stuff that you take in, right? So we want to see what the difference is between the stuff that you give away and the stuff that you take in. Now, in this case, imports are at 4 trillion and exports are at 2 trillion. So when we take 2 trillion for our exports and we subtract 4 trillion, we get a negative number. So that means we must then subtract that number from our total because we're giving away more than we're taking in. So that means that the total number is 33 trillion. Did that right? Yeah, 32 trillion. So that's how you do it. We want to make sure that we're calculating everything in an economy and we don't count the stuff that we get rid of. So that's what that means. All right. What is the difference between a real amount and a nominal amount? Getting better at that word. All right. Real amounts are adjusted for inflation. Nominal amounts are not. So if I in 2020 am paid $40,000 a year, in 2020, I can say that the real amount that I made, my real wage, was $40,000, and the nominal wage, the wage number assigned to that year, was also 40,000. Now, the next year, 2021, let's say that I still make $40,000. So nominally speaking, the number that I made in 2021 was still 40,000. However, inflation has occurred, and so the amount of stuff that I can buy with that $40,000 has gone down. Therefore, the real amount of money that I made is less than $40,000. And so if the inflation rate is higher than the rate of my wage increase, did I say rate? Rate of my wage increase, sorry. If inflation goes up faster than my wage goes up, then I'm actually losing money. Even if I get a nice pay raise and my boss says, hey, professor, you're doing so great, we're going to give you a 1% pay raise, but inflation is at 2%. Well, it's not good for me, right? So a couple more, and then I'll move on. Select the true statement. All right. The money I make this year by selling something I produced in a previous year will not be counted as part of the nation's GDP, meaning this year, because the overall cost of production was counted in a previous year. So I don't want to count stuff twice. If I made a chair in 2020 and I put it in inventory, leave it in inventory till 2023, and then I sell it, now it's not going to be counted as part of the GDP. And the reason is because the cost of production, the actual value that I added to the economy, was already accounted for in 2020. So we don't want to count twice. That is a no-no. All right, what is the definition of GDP per capita? It is the GDP divided by the population of a given country. So we take the GDP, we divide the GDP by the number of people to get the amount of GDP per person. And off the top of my head, in America, it's something like $33 trillion is the GDP, and 33 trillion is the GDP, and then we have about 340 million people. So I would say that would be like 70,000 a year would be the GDP per capita, but I don't know. If you want to Google that, feel free. So, all right. That was our quiz. Okay, anybody have any questions? We only have one guy watching at home. All right. All right. I talked a lot about this quiz, which is unfortunate because I did not get to talk a lot about what I really wanted to. Even though I like going over the quizzes, there is a lot that I wanted to talk about today involving something known as the business cycle. Okay, so if you don't have any questions, I'm going to move on. And I have to change the camera as well. So I'm going to move up to the front of the classroom And I'm going to shout because these room mics are really bad at picking up my voice. Okay. Can you see at home the board pretty well? And can you still hear me pretty well?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. So what this is whenever you guys were younger, did you ever watch Pokemon?
Yeah.
You ever watch Pokemon? And you remember at the end of Pokemon, they did the Who's That Pokemon thing where it was like a shadow of a Pokemon and
Yeah.
you kind of like had to guess what it was and then it would be like Pikachu and yeah, so that's what this is. This is the Who's That Pokemon, but it's an economics graph. And if you don't know what it is, I'll tell you. It's the business cycle. All right. So let me show you. Can you see the writing pretty well? Good at home? All right.
Yeah.
So the business cycle is essentially just a way of describing what's going on in the economy. All right. So the business cycle just refers to the period of alternating increases and decreases in economic activity. Now, I told you guys that the definitions will be available to you on Canvas, and they are. But for right now, let me just tell you that definition so that you can follow along in this lecture and it'll make sense to you. The business cycle tries to describe what's going on in the economy. What we have is we have a normal period of economic expansion. The economy grows. And then we hit something called a peak, meaning that the economy reaches the amount that it can produce, and then it doesn't go any higher. Then the economy starts to slow down. It decreases in its size and its productive capability, and we will call that decrease a recession. When the recession ends and the economy rebounds and starts to do better, that is known as a trough. And then when it's doing better, we call that an expansion or a recovery. It's the same thing, right? So expansion is just referring to a recovery like in isolate, meaning that I'm just talking about how the economy is growing. But if we're talking about a specific rebound after a recession, we'll call that a recovery. But it's the same thing, right? So the idea here is that the economy expands at some rate and contracts at some rate, and then it changes its direction at the given interval of a peak and a trough. However, the business cycle does not actually exist. This is not something that determines the course of economic activity. Laws like supply and demand, those determine the course of economic activity. Those exist, right? The business cycle is just a way of explaining what people observe. And I don't really like the business cycle, okay? This is the Professor Capelli School of Economics. The business cycle is actually not cyclical. It's not fixed, right? So like, for example, winter every year arrives in December, right? And it's cold until about the beginning of March, and then we have springtime. So that's a seasonal period, right? And so when we have seasonality, we have some frequent occurrence of something at a fixed interval. But there's nothing fixed about the business cycle. You can have expansions that last for years, decades even. And conversely, you can have expansions that last a couple months. You can have recessions that last for years, or you can have recessions that last for a couple months. And so I don't really like the business cycle. It's not actually a real thing. It's just sort of something that describes the world. But I have to teach it to you guys because you have to be able to recognize it whenever you come across it in the future. So that's the idea of the business cycle. Now let me point something out to you that might not be immediately obvious. Okay, so recessions and expansions are discussing changes in economic activity. A recession means that economic activity has slowed down, and expansions mean that economic activity is speeding up. It's growing. Remember, I told you that the physics problem where like I'm driving my car at 60 miles an hour, and a guy passes me and he's driving his car at 80 miles an hour. and then he sees a cop and he slows down. And then he gets to me at 60 miles an hour, right? At no point, whenever he was going 80 and he slowed down to go to 60, was he going any slower than I was going. He was going faster than 60 miles an hour the entire time. Okay. The only way that you can say he's going slower than you is if he actually starts going slower. Okay. You can't just magically jump from 80 to 60. You have to slow down to 79 and 78 and 77 and so forth until you get to 60. So your rate is decreasing, but it's not going down overall. So we have a starting point at some number, and then whenever we have a recession, we have a decrease, right? Doesn't necessarily mean it goes below the initial number, but that's kind of what we're getting. The economy slows down. Really bad recessions are when the economy contracts. So we have slow growth, but then we're talking about actual negative growth. That means recession. So expansion simply means the economy is growing bigger, doing better, able to buy more, right? Doesn't necessarily mean it's always being done in a smart way. The government might invest in things that don't make a lot of sense, but a lot of people make a lot of money early on, and I'll explain how that works in a moment. But we have an expansion, right? So expansions and recessions are referring to changes in economic activity. However, peaks and troughs are not. Peaks and troughs are simply referring to the time periods that delineate each interval, right? A peak, all a peak is it's the end point of an expansion, and it's the beginning of a recession. All a trough is it is the end point of a recession and the beginning of an expansion. That's it. That's all it is. And so expansions and recessions are fundamentally different in their nature from peaks and troughs. Does that make sense? All right. You guys see this purple line going through the middle of my graph? This thing right here is a trend line. Trend line basically tells you which general direction you're going whenever you write a graph. So, like, for example, you can see that this line is kind of going in a general, like, upward direction, which means your economy is growing, right? So you're growing right here, and you hit a peak and then go down into recession. Economy's not doing so good, but you're around the corner and you go back into an expansion, you have a recovery, and then when you total up everything, you add together all the growth and subtract all of the not growth, and then you get your trend line. You basically see if we have more growth than decay, or we have more expansion than recession, we are growing. If we have more recession than expansion, sometimes you can have expansions, but overall, your economy looks like this. Okay. My father would be very disappointed in me that I'm erasing my beautiful artwork, denying my Italian heritage, like Michelangelo and Da Vinci. So this is what I just described to you. We are looking at a positive trend right here, positive meaning growth. And yes, we have expansions, pretty sharp expansions, and then we have recessions. So we grow a little bit, we decline a little bit less, we grow a little bit more, we decline a little bit less. And that gives us overall growth. The opposite is true for this graph. When we have a little bit of growth, a lot of decay, a little bit of growth, a lot of decay, a little bit of growth, and a lot of decay, overall, our economy is declining. Our graph is declining, right? And that is where inflation comes in, all right? I told you guys a little bit about the short run and the long run last lecture. And the difference between the two is that nobody really knows, right? Nobody really can tell you definitively what the difference is between the short run and the long run. But we do know that there is a difference, and we do know that the short run means pretty much immediately, and the long run means like in the long run. I don't know how else to put it. It's just far away in time. It's a very difficult concept to explain, but pretty easy to understand. The short run would be like, what am I doing today? The long run would be like, what am I doing in 5 years, right? what's the overall progression of my life as opposed to what am I doing day by day? You can kind of look at it in the same vein as looking at macro and microeconomics. Macro is just one short perspective, one tiny piece of the puzzle. And did I say macro or micro?
We said micro.
Micro is what I'm saying. Thank you. I don't know.
No, you said macro.
Did I say that?
I'm looking on the script.
Oh, the transcript betrayed me. Okay, yes. I said macro, I meant micro. Micro is the individual's perspective, and macro is the overall perspective. It's late in the day. Maybe I can't talk anymore. I don't know. All right, so kind of the same thing with this. When you inflate the currency, you can do this. You can make the economy look like that. You can increase the currency. Businesses have more money. They can hire people. But, oh, what happens in the long run, which is represented by this as well, we have the natural rate of unemployment. Natural rate of unemployment is always going to exist. It never goes away. And so, yes, in the short run, you can inflate your currency and experience some positive effects. However, if you keep doing it, and the overall effects of your currency inflation are compounded in such a way that you experience negative growth in the long run, your graph is going to look like that, which means your economy is having some bad news, I guess. It's not good for the overall economy. A lot of people are not going to be happy, right? Our government, through the usage of the program of quantitative easing, this policy, this methodology that the government uses to control the economy now, tries to get it to look like this. A little bit of inflation, a lot less decay, a little more inflation, a lot less decay, a little more inflation. And they just cross their fingers and hope it works, right? And everybody just kind of pinky swears that they won't lose their money, I guess. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the short run and the long run, as you look at it on a graph, okay? And it's an interesting concept because we don't really know what the difference between the short run and the long run is, but we know that there's a difference. It's really hard to define because it's different for everybody. That's the beauty of being a human being in this world, is that the difference for every business, the difference for every human being and what they're interested in and what they spend their money on is significant. And so you can't really say what the difference is in the overall sense, but you can say that there is a difference. It's just hard to define. All right. Am I making sense? Yeah. Interesting, huh? Phone over here? Okay, whatever. All right. So I don't have my alarm. So when it's 6:45, just let me know, I guess, if you don't mind. I know I told you guys that this is not a history class and that I'm not gonna harp on history too much, but I lied. Of course, I'm going to talk about history because I feel like the economic examples that you can glean from history are excellent. They're very good teachers for us. History is the best teacher you can find, better than me by far. And so history can tell us a lot about economics. It doesn't have to just be the cool study of who wins what wars and everything like that. It can tell us a lot about how people spend their money and what happens when they do it wrong. All right, so let's pretend like we were alive a couple hundred years ago. Do you guys remember the president Thomas Jefferson? So he was the third president of the United States, right? So Thomas Jefferson was president of the United States from 1801 to 1809. And actually, one of the things that he did had a pretty profound impact on Colorado. He had a pretty prominent expedition that went west. Do you guys know what I'm talking about before I give you the answer? Sent a pretty prominent group of 2 explorers and their lady friend who was a Native American. No, she lived about 250 years before that. There you go, yeah. So Meriwether Lewis and William Clark went out west in 1803. Sounds like the beginning of a nice story, right? And they found this lady named Sacagawea, and they went up to Washington State and they built this fort called Fort Clatsop, and then they came back to, St. Louis and then made their way over to Washington and told President Jefferson, and they were like, yeah, the West is cool. We should buy it, right? So Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase. He was the president that initiated the Louisiana Purchase. He bought Louisiana from our friend Napoleon, the French emperor at the time. And that was good for us because it doubled the size of the United States, doubled the available land and resources that we could use, right? And Colorado was part of Louisiana at that point. I don't know if you knew that. He also sent an expedition west that was less well known, but it was at the same time as Lewis and Clark went west. There was a guy named Captain Zebulon Pike, who, yeah, real name. Look, he got a cool name, right? Like Zebulon is kind of cool. My name is Frank, so I like my name, but I don't think it's as interesting as Zebulon. I don't know. So Zebulon Pike was a captain in the army. He was a lieutenant at the time of his expedition, but he was a captain when he died in the War of 1812 in Quebec. So sorry to say. But he went out west and he came to Colorado and he graciously gave his name to Pikes Peak, which is the mountain in Colorado Springs that everybody always sees, right? So Lewis and Clark, Zebulon Pike, Thomas Jefferson, they had a little bit of an effect on Colorado, which is where we are today. But interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson actually did some other things that were pretty profound when you look at the economics that he influenced. So I don't know if you guys knew this, but some 30 years prior, 40 years prior, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Yes. Thomas Jefferson, little known fact for you guys, was also responsible for the worst year of the economy's history in the United States. He crashed the economy way worse than the Great Depression did. Can you believe that? Did you ever think that a depression in this country could have occurred that was worse than the Great Depression? Because there was one in 1808. Pretty bad stuff. And this is how it happened. All right. And this is why I have to explain the history. So bear with me. I have this feeling that you guys are like, okay, come on, professor, get it over with. Let's get back to the economics. So for a long time after the end of the Revolutionary War and the beginning of our nation's history, the British Empire, which was kind of like a different phase of its empire at that point, the British didn't really look at us as an independent nation as much as like their little brother. And they would frequently take American sailors from their ships that they were on, merchant ships, and put them into their own British Royal Navy. That was called impressment. It was the practice of impressment. And in fact, in those days, even though we speak with this modern American accent today, a lot of people in the United States sounded indistinguishable from people in Britain. So complicated, right? The British were taking sailors, and the Americans were not happy about it. They were really, really mad. And you'd be too if somebody was stealing your sailors, right, Ryan? So it's interesting because a lot of different solutions were proposed about how we could fix this problem. So by 1807, the problem was getting so bad that Thomas Jefferson thought he would give it a try. He said, all right, we got to stop sailors from getting kidnapped. How do we do that? We weren't strong enough to fight the British. The British were already at war with Napoleon. That's why they were taking sailors in the first place. They needed people to man their ships of their navy. So that's why they had the reason to take American sailors. So Thomas Jefferson came up with this brilliant idea. He said, we're just going to get rid of all the American sailors. We're going to close our economy to the rest of the world. No more exports. All right. So he created this thing called the Embargo Act of 1807. Okay, you know this?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think it was an embargo.
There you go. Yeah, that's what an embargo is. It's a prevention of trade. And so it's interesting. Thomas Jefferson pushed this through the Congress, and then all of a sudden, no Americans were allowed to do any business with any other country. This was specifically targeted towards the British, but the problem was Great Britain also ruled our northern neighbor, which was Canada. It is Canada. So most of the trade that was done from places like New England or close to the Canadian border was not with other colonies, later states in the United States. It was with Canada. And so the British could very easily circumvent the embargo just by going through Canada. Thomas Jefferson knew this. He knew that the only way to prevent American goods from falling into the hands of the British was to create this Embargo Act that sealed the country, right? It's the only time in America's history where America's economy became a closed economy. Now, I'll explain what that means in just a moment, but let me just finish my explanation and it'll make sense. So this is the idea that if you prevent the British from getting their hands on any goods that we have coming from America, they will not only be poor, but they won't have an opportunity to kidnap the people who are carrying those goods on their ships, the sailors, right? So this is the idea behind the Embargo Act of 1807. However, It backfired. It backfired so badly that America's economy totally crashed and then had to be repealed in 1809. So 1808, not a good year, right? Now, no coincidence there that Thomas Jefferson did not stand for re-election. So he was president up until 1809, and then the president after him was James Madison, who had to deal with the mess. And of course, the War of 1812 was begun anyways in 1812, and that was a different story. But impressment was one of the reasons why we fought the War of 1812 against the British. So, interestingly enough, Mr. Jefferson's idea of preventing trade with the British became what we call a double-edged sword, which means it not only hurt them, it hurt us. And in fact, it hurt us way more than it hurt them. Because even though we were an important trading partner with the British, they had a lot more trading partners than we did. All right. And the fact that Americans weren't doing business with anybody meant that the British no longer had to worry about competing with us. Right. So this is the idea of a sanction. This is why sanctions don't really work, because you want to stick it to your enemy, right? You want to say, you guys, you misbehaved, and so from now on, you're not going to be a part of the party. We're going to embargo something. We're going to take away something of yours. But I told you that supply and demand, which are the two forces that constitute trade, are fundamentally just different versions of the same thing. These sanctions, this embargo, works both ways, but it's very hard to see how it would work both ways before you do it. And that's why the only way that you can really see the effects of these things is through trial and error. Because nobody ever listens to the economists who say, don't do that. Right? So it's interesting. The Embargo Act was a disaster. America's economy got cut in half. The size of its economy cratered, right? Went down. And the British were totally fine. They were like, okay, cool. We don't have to worry about the Americans anymore. Very, very not mid. Okay. Whatever the opposite of peak, I think, right? Now, in America, goods would just simply rot. They couldn't sell them, and so they were just done for. All right. They have to throw them away. And that's bad, right? Reduces the efficiency of your economy, reduces the overall amount of goods and services that you can produce. A lot of people got put out of a job. It's not good. Why I told you this story is I'm trying to demonstrate to you two different concepts. The first concept is the concept of the open economy. So the open economy is just the economy that you have as it relates to other economies in the world. We call that the effect of globalization. And in our modern world, pretty much every economy is now an open economy, meaning that everybody does business with other economies, right? If you drew a big bubble and each economy in the world was part of the bubble, they would all be connected to each other somehow. Like this pen, it's from Japan, right? These shoes were probably made in Portugal. A lot of leather shoes are made in Portugal. I don't know if you knew that. A lot of goods and stuff, it's right here, probably made in China, right? So in America, we have what we call the open economy. However, the contrary term for that is the closed economy. So what's the closed economy? It is an economy that exists in the world, so it exists in an environment of other economies, but it doesn't interact with them. So no importing, no exporting. There aren't really any examples of a closed economy today. There are no truly closed economies. Maybe North Korea might get close. You can get kind of close. That's right. Well, so it's not truly closed. They still trade with China. They still trade with Russia. They still trade with Vietnam, places like that. Morocco is another one that's kind of close. However, you cannot really find an example of an economy these days that's truly closed. However, in history, you absolutely could. There are different kingdoms that existed throughout history that were definitely closed economies. And unfortunately for us, in 1808, we were one of them. The United States was a closed economy, and it had disastrous impacts. So why then am I telling you about this? And how does it relate to the business cycle? So I'll keep shutting off. Okay, so business cycles try to gauge economic activity. Remember, I told you that they're not driving it. Economic activity is driven by expansions. What economies really do, what economies really are their expansions as the population grows bigger, right? As we have more people, we have more mouths to feed. We're trying to innovate. We're trying to find more efficient ways to live our lives. Population change is a big driver of economic innovation, but it's not always. I mean, China has a much larger population than the United States, but we have a higher standard of living. We have a more valuable economy. So population change is part of the story, but the idea is that the economy expands. All right. People always find new technology. The march of progression is usually forward, and so economies expand. From time to time, they are subject to shocks. Okay. Shocks meaning that you have interruptions in the expansion that cause contractions. That's not cyclical. All right. That's not something that has to happen. That just happens as a result of interventions. So, COVID, for example, it was not coronavirus that caused the devastating contraction in our nation's economy. Our economy, by the way, in the second quarter of 2020 contracted by 30%. So that was a big contraction, pretty big one. It rebounded in the third quarter by almost exactly that number because President Trump wanted the numbers to look good for the election. I don't know if you guys remember on election night talking about the huge increases in economic activity that he was responsible for. So he said stuff like that, Interesting stuff. Politics is inextricably intertwined with economics. So that's why whenever I talk about economics, I always mention the political stuff because it matters. Politicians always use the economy as their tool, right? So it's interesting. We have expansions and we have a world economy, right? The stuff that we have available for us in our own economy might not, in our own society, our own resources, for example, might not be what's available in other places. They may have something over in China or Japan that is more valuable to us than it is to them. That's why they export things from those countries. That's what exports are. Think about it. I told you guys at the beginning of the semester that if I want to buy something, like let's say for the sake of example, there's a guy selling pumpkins and I want to buy a pumpkin. I go to him and I want that pumpkin. I say, sir, I will take one of those, please. And he gives me my pumpkin and I give him my money. He has the supply of the pumpkins and I have the demand for those pumpkins. But I also have the supply of money to give him to satisfy his demand, which is for my money, right? It's a trade that works both ways. Okay. And so we both benefit. I benefit because I get what, if I didn't want the pumpkin more than I wanted the money, I wouldn't have taken it. Same thing. If he wanted his pumpkin more than he wanted my money, he would have kept his pumpkin because people hold on to what they value, right? So if we're trading with another country, if they are sending over stuff that we want and we give them money in return and they want it, we both benefit. And that's a good thing. Now, when things like tariffs come into play, adjustments in taxation for doing business in another country, that's what a tariff is a tax to do business in another country. We get stuff like that. We get shocks to the economy. Now, they're not as big as the one that happened for COVID, but these things matter, right? Because if you close off your economy, all of a sudden you're no longer able to trade with most of the people that we were trading with. So the international economy is very important, right? We import more food now than we export. Can you believe that? It's not always been that way. The United States is usually an exporter of food, but in the last 2 years, we've been a net importer. So these things are important to take into account. The business cycle looked a lot different before 1913. Why would it be 1913 as the year that I'm saying the business cycle looked a lot different for? What is so important about 1913? The Federal Reserve was created in 1913. The Federal Reserve is a central bank that manages our nation's money supply. Now, before 1913, I'll show you what our economy looked like. It looks something like this. We had maybe a dip in the Civil War, but that's basically what it was. General, pretty nice growth. And at the end of the 1800s, so at the end of the 19th century, we had the closest approximation to a totally free market that we've ever had in this country's history. Not a coincidence that we also had the greatest period of uninterrupted growth in our nation's economy in our nation's history. Now, I told my other class this earlier today, and I'll say it here. Correlation does not imply causation. You know what that means? All right. And so correlation and causation, you want to take a crack at it? Exactly. Correlation, meaning two events look like they match each other in their shape, right? If you're looking at a graph, two events kind of follow the same patterns. However, does that necessarily mean they are the cause of each other? Are they the reason why they look the same? No, that's called causation. Causation, like I told you guys at the beginning of the semester, you have to really be able to think to find that out, right? Correlation does not imply causation. It means that when you look on a graph, all you're really seeing are the effects. You're not seeing the real world causes. You're just seeing the evidence, right? So you got to be able to find the real world causes. When we talk about economic growth, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how to find the causes, right? So uninterrupted growth stemming from our free market was the hallmark of the 1800s. In 1913, the Federal Reserve took over and began regulating the flow of currency. All right. Now, I'm not necessarily laying the blame for all of these recessions at the feet of the Federal Reserve, but I kind of am because they're the ones that created this idea that currency must be managed. We no longer had an independent currency. We had the Federal Reserve that was basically organizing central banking and everything like that. And now all of a sudden you had much more cyclicality and seasonality for our expansions and recessions. We don't necessarily need to have recessions, right? What we have is growth as the market allocates its resources. And then whenever we find new ways to allocate resources, those resources are now moved from one sector of the economy to another. However, when we're talking about the Federal Reserve inflating the money supply, all of a sudden, businesses have a bunch of money to spend. They hire new workers. However, market activity does not always agree with that. And so when you hit a recession, that means that you need to readjust. The market readjusts. That's the shock. All right. And so, absent this huge rate of inflation, which got even worse after we were removed from the gold standard, we would have just had that. It's a very ugly graph, but that's the idea. My cell phone. Weird. All right. So, very interesting topic. You have any questions so far? So, yeah, we have the business cycle, not necessarily defined due to economic law, but this is just sort of something that we actually use to describe economic activity. That's the difference. All right, that's what I'm trying to get at. So, international economics is pretty interesting. Here in America, we have an open economy, but in the real world, you don't really ever find closed economies, but they can exist, right? So, like Thomas Jefferson's experiment with the closed economy, that was a 1 year experiment that didn't really go so well, but kind of how it went. All right. So, what's interesting is that you don't really need the business cycle to dictate economic profit and economic loss. So, 1/3 of businesses that open up in the United States don't last for more than 2 years. Okay. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Where'd you learn that?
You were perhaps my dad.
Was born knowing it. That's fine. That's actually true. That's good that you know it. Yeah, 1/3 of businesses that are opened in this country don't last for more than 2 years. And half of overall businesses that are opened up in this country don't last for more than 4. So when you look at businesses that are really successful, like Apple, an American company, the question that you should ask is not how have they lasted so long? Well, actually, that is the question you should ask. How have they made it so far? You shouldn't ask why do they make so much money. You should ask how in the world have they been so successful? So businesses don't always do so hot. What does that have to do with the business cycle, right? The business cycle is talking about the economy. Businesses are what operate within the economy, okay? So businesses rise and fall due to market demand. We dictate which businesses are successful and which ones are not based on the value that they add into my life, your lives. And the way that they do that is by guessing. That's why there's a lot of money to be made if you're a pretty good guesser. If you're an economist that knows how to read markets very well, then you can make a lot of money providing sound economic advice to businesses and saying, hey, this is a market trend. You should try to orient your business to these customers to try to make money, right? Profits are what drive a business. Okay, businesses have to make money in order to survive. You have to make money to pay your bills, right? But profits serve another very important function in businesses that often get overlooked. This function often gets overlooked. And that function is as a signal. If you're profiting, that's telling you that you're doing something correctly. And if you have a lot of losses on your balance sheet, that means you're doing something wrong. And what happens when your losses are greater than your profits? You go out of business. Yeah. There you go. So it's an interesting world we live in. The business cycle does not strictly dictate economics, but that's just what we use to describe it. Now, I don't like the business cycle. I really don't. I think that it's not an accurate way to describe how economies really are. The business cycle in this country is more or less a result, I think, of central banking. And you get that a lot in industrial economies, right? We have industrial economies that are predicated on things like manufacturing. However, it's often overlooked, but every industrial economy in the world also has a central bank. Look at that, it's hiding in plain sight, right? The culprit right there. So, definitely an interesting world we live in. Any questions? Last thing I want to talk about, and then we are free to go, is unemployment. Like I was mentioning, the difference between the short run and the long run. All right. Whenever you increase the currency's supply, when you increase the money supply, you are able to give a lot of money to businesses in the short run that they can then use to expand their businesses. Because what's better than money is more money. And when businesses have some money, they invest it in themselves to try to make their businesses bigger so they can make even more money. That's how that works. And a lot of businesses actually operate on a razor thin margin. Your profit margin is the difference between your profits and your expenditures, right? The actual money that is coming into your business and the money that you have to spend in order to operate that business. Restaurants, for example. If you are the owner of a restaurant, not making a lot of money. Profits for restaurants are not that high. They have a notoriously thin margin for profit. That's why a lot of restaurants open up and then they close pretty quickly because the market is very finicky. A lot of people are very particular about what they eat, right? So if you see a restaurant that's been around for like 150 years, you can basically guarantee that it's a good restaurant. Or they're just, I don't know, stealing money. I don't know. But essentially, profits are very, very thin for a lot of companies. And so whenever they have inflation, whenever they have an increase in the money that they can spend, they hire people. Unemployment goes down in the short run whenever you inflate the currency, but not in the long run, because in the long run, the economy constantly adjusts itself. We get that natural rate of unemployment, right? People are not perfect. They self-select. They don't want to stay in the businesses that they work in. They can't sustain the businesses that they own. People have to move between sectors, so they go from being a doctor to a journalist or something. I don't know. But essentially, that's what happens. Is in the long run, inflation will not get rid of unemployment, and that's that. I erased them, but that was those little graphs. How increases in inflation can decrease unemployment, but not in the long run. Okay, the last thing I'll say, actually, the real last thing, the last thing I'll say is just a quick set of definitions for you. Savings, the amount of money that you don't spend, you put it in the bank. Those are your savings. Savings, that's an important value to keep in mind whenever you're calculating the national income. We're not going to do that in this class. That's like a graduate level macroeconomics course. This is basic stuff. Savings is the money that you put in the bank. However, the money that you put in the bank doesn't just sit there. Other people spend your savings. The bank lends out the money that you put in there. That's what we call the fractional reserve system, like we talked about. Remember, I wasn't kidding when I said that this class builds on itself. So the savings that you put in the bank become somebody else's expenditures. So there are really only two things that you can do with money. You can save it or you can spend it. And you can only kind of spend it a couple different ways. You can actually buy something that gives you immediate gratification, but does not add any overall value to your life other than that, or you can invest your money to try to increase its overall amount. So you can either spend your money right away, or you can invest it, or you can save it. So those are your options. And that is where I'm going to leave off today. So that's all that we have time for today, ladies and gentlemen. All four of you who joined me today, thank you. If you have any questions, let me know. So shoot me an email, stick around for office hours. I just also love to hear the sound of my own voice and your voices. I love to talk. So come and find me and we'll schedule an appointment and we'll talk about all sorts of stuff, okay? So if anybody has any questions, pose them now. If not, you are free to go. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care.